This is going to show you how to assemble the kit that's prescribed in the curriculum, and we're going to go ahead and start with something that's already been kind of halfway pre-assembled. So the first thing we're going to do is attach the DC motors, and notice that there are two types of motors. There are DC motors with red and black wires, as well as servo motors, or one servo motor with 3 wires coming out of it. The DC motors operate freely and can drive the wheels of the robot, whereas the servo motor is designed to rotate to a specific position, and it's called an actuator. You can do things like attach a sensor mass to it. So it's important to note that you can only use the DC motors to drive the wheels of the robot itself. So I'm going to go ahead and insert it into the chassis, and we're going to use these small threaded M2 screws to hold it in place. There's a coarse threaded one that comes with the DC motors as well, but that one's actually used to drive, to attach the wheel to the drive motor. Now this is a little bit tricky to do, and it's best done with another set of hands, but let's see if I can get the nut onto the screw. And once it's been threaded, I can go ahead and just tighten it up. Now you'll notice that I've attached the motors with the axles facing the inside of the robot, and now I'm going to go ahead and attach the wheel. The wheel itself can go onto the DC motor. There's a little bit of a slot for it, and then we have these coarse threaded screws of approximately the same size that we can use to attach the wheel to the motor. Okay, now to attach the caster wheel, it's got 4 screw points, and it uses a different size and shape of screw. The specific screw that we're looking for is this one, which is called a countersunk M3 screw. Notice that it doesn't have a bubble-shaped head, called a pan head, and it sits flush with the caster's surface itself. It does have to be held on the other side by a larger nut called an M3 nut. And you can tighten that up with a screwdriver. Now to attach the brains to the robot. So all of it's going to be attached onto this secondary plate, which is going to sit on top of the robot. To do that, we're going to start with the P1 board. Now the P1 board is shaped like an Arduino form factor board. We don't want it to directly touch the plate because of these solder points. So what we're going to do is use these larger M3 screws that are long and use them to create what's called a standoff. I'll go ahead and put in an M3 screw by the DC barrel jack and another one over here by the Wi-Fi antenna. That allows me to take this nut and thread it on part way. And when it's all tightened up, these nuts will keep the board from touching the chassis itself. So I can insert it into place, and I'll tighten it up later on both ends, but I'm going to also use these M3 nylon lock nuts to hold the entire robot brain down onto the chassis plate. These lock nuts are important because they actually have a little bit of nylon inside of them that prevent the screw from backing out. They're pretty useful. So once again, best to have a second pair of hands, but I'm going to go ahead and use my pliers to go ahead and turn the lock nuts. The lock nuts do provide quite a bit of resistance because of the fact that they are designed to lock into place. So don't worry about using a little bit of force to get the nut to finish threading. Once you get one most of the way in, that's a good time to start on the other one. So kind of a good rule to follow is that you don't want to tighten everything down all the way until you're absolutely certain it's in the correct position. So with that in mind, I'll go ahead and start on the second lock nut. And screw that down most of the way. So I can position it how I like. Once I'm satisfied with the positioning, then I can tighten the entire thing down. And once again, best to have a second pair of hands helping you out on this one. Okay. So once that's been tightened up in place, and I'm not going to go ahead and tighten this up all the way for brevity, I'm going to go ahead and attach the motor shield on top of it. To attach the motor shield, notice that it does have these stacking header pins, which may come already pre-soldered on your motor shield, or you might have to do it yourself, and I can show you a video on how to do that next. We'll go ahead and insert the pins, and you're going to want to make sure that all the pins fit directly inside of the headers. They might require a little bit of nudging if they weren't soldered on straight like my pins weren't. So once they all fit in, it locks in place. And you'll notice that there's actually 2 pins right here, and this is the first important connection. This is what's called the power bridge, and it's gonna, once we bridge it with this jumper, it's gonna provide power from the Arduino to, or in this case, the Photon Red board to the shield itself. And that's what's gonna power our motors. Now, ordinarily you wouldn't power large motors like this, but for the purposes of our robot, because it's using weak motors that don't draw a lot of current, then this will do just fine. So now we have to attach the plates on it. We have these brass standoffs. I've put in 1 screw over here, and I'll go ahead and insert it and slide it in from this side onto the bottom chassis. I can screw that in place, and I can do the same with the other side. And this provides a platform for the control hardware. The reason why I want to do that is because I'm going to put a battery down onto the plate later on, but the battery is rather heavy, so we want it to be on the bottom of the robot. So I'll use pan head screws and also screw them into the top side of those brass standoffs. And now that's held in place. This is a good time to tighten everything down. In this case, I'm not going to be able to tighten these down, but any of the other screw connections you're going to want to make sure are nice and tight, because now we're going to go ahead and attach the battery. And I find the best way to do it is with the rubber band, and I can rubber band that down into the bottom, and it's nothing fancy. Okay, now to attach the motors. The first thing we're going to attach is the servo motor, and I see a port that says servo 1. You can look at the documentation on the motor shield to know which way it goes, but I'm going to go ahead and tell you that the yellow wire is going to go on this pin block, and it's going to go closest to the black headers over here. So we want the yellow wire close to the headers. Now the next part is where we attach the motor, the drive motors to the shield, and you'll notice that they're too short. So I'm going to go ahead and use these male-to-male jumper cables. I'll insert a red one and a black one, and then I'll attach it to the screw terminals. This screw terminal actually has powers 2 different motors, motor 1 and motor 2. I can turn the screws counterclockwise to loosen up the terminals themselves, and then insert the wires. Now you might say, well, does the black one go on the left or does the red one go on the left? It does not matter in terms of keeping the motor safe, because the motor is designed to operate in 2 directions depending on the polarity of how you connect it. However, it does matter when you do power it up, and you want to make sure that your firmware is going forward when you tell it to go forward. Otherwise, the motors will spin the wrong direction. So you can test that out for yourself. But I'm going to go ahead and attach it this way, and I don't know whether or not it's the correct direction. We'll find out when we power up the robot. Now, I've already flashed firmware into the Photon Red board. Yours may not come with firmware pre-flashed, therefore the motors may not operate. But I'll show you what that looks like. Once I've screwed those in, these are nice and secure, and it tightens up onto the cables themselves, or the wires. I'm going to go ahead and attach power. And I'll put in the USB battery here, and then plug in the red board. It doesn't matter which order you do it. I tend to, when I disconnect power, only remove the large port, because if I damage this port from plugging it in and unplugging it, that's going to be difficult to repair and replace. So I'll go ahead and plug it in, and you'll notice that the LEDs on board the Photon light up, and then it starts running. So that's how to assemble the robot chassis. I'm going to unplug it now by taking out the power from the battery. And all of these wires, you're probably going to want to secure with rubber bands and make sure they're nice and neat.